Welcome to Macroeconomics 101, everyone. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most incredible paradigm shifts in economic history. Think of this explainer as a journey, a real, genuine intellectual escape from some very deeply entrenched economic habits. We're going to look at how a massive global crisis basically blew up the established rules of the game, and how a completely new framework had to be built from the rubble just to understand the modern economy. So, let's just jump right in.
Okay, here's our quick roadmap for today. We're going to hit the classical economic orthodoxy, see Say's law in action, look at the Great Depression disconnect, explore Keynes's intellectual escape, break down effective demand, and wrap up with modern fiscal policy. Let's get to it.
All right, part one, the classical economic orthodoxy, or as I like to call it, the old habits.
So before the 1930s, the economic establishment had this supreme, almost unshakable confidence in the invisible hand of the market. I mean, look at this timeline. Stretching all the way from Adam Smith in the late 18th century through James Mill in 1808, right up to David Ricardo and John Baptiste Say in the 19th century, there was this dominant, unified belief. These brilliant classical thinkers honestly believed that a general glut, meaning a permanent, economy-wide overproduction of goods leading to massive unemployment, was, well, basically impossible. They figured any idling of workers or factories was just a temporary glitch, something the free market would just naturally autocorrect.
Moving on to part two, Say's law in action. This was essentially their ultimate comfort blanket. If classical economics was a religion, Say's law was absolutely its golden rule. It was the comfort blanket that assured everyone the economic machine would never, ever permanently stall out. Say's law is famously summed up like this: supply creates its own demand. And honestly, the intuition here is kind of beautiful in its simplicity. The idea is that every single time a business produces and sells something, it automatically generates the exact amount of income needed to buy it, right? Producing a good pays the worker their wage, the manager their salary, and the owner their profit. So simply by supplying things, you are arming the population with the exact purchasing power they need to demand those very goods.
To really hammer this home, look at this quote from John Stuart Mill. What constitutes the means of payment for commodities is simply commodities. All sellers are inevitably buyers. Now you might be wondering, what about saving? What if people just don't spend all their money? Well, the classical economists had an answer for that too. They assumed every single dollar saved in a bank would automatically be borrowed and invested by entrepreneurs, balanced out by fluctuating interest rates. So in their minds, money never just sat idle. It was always coursing through the system, keeping everything humming along perfectly at full employment. Which brings us to part three, the Great Depression disconnect. This is where the theory violently collides with reality. So here is where that beautiful, elegant classical theory hits a massive brick wall. I want to throw this crucial question out to you. The exact same question that kept economists up at night in the early 1930s. What actually happens when supply doesn't create demand? What happens when that impossible general glut, that total economic paralysis that classical thinkers swore could never exist, actually unfolds right in front of your eyes?
Well, the reality was absolutely devastating. Between 1933 and 1935, unemployment in the United States skyrocketed to over 20%. Just let that sink in for a second. More than 1 in 5 people. And think about what that meant on the ground. The factories weren't destroyed. The machinery hadn't just vanished into thin air. The tech of the 1920s was still there, and millions of capable people were desperate to work. The actual physical capacity to supply goods was perfectly intact. So what we get is this massive paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty. The economy's ability to supply hadn't dropped one bit, but a severe, paralyzing lack of demand had just completely frozen the system. People were literally starving while farms were producing excess food they couldn't even sell. Say's law, that reliable old comfort blanket, just completely fell apart in the short run. Producing goods was absolutely no longer automatically creating the demand to buy them.
That brings us to part 4, Keynes's intellectual escape, or the breaking point.
Enter British economist John Maynard Keynes. He looks around at the absolute devastation of the 1930s and realizes, okay, this entire foundation needs to be ripped up and replaced. In 1936, he dropped his masterwork, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And in it, Keynes forcefully took a sledgehammer to the core postulates of classical economics. He argued that the old classical theory really only applied to a very specific special case, a state of perfect full employment, but it was disastrously misleading when applied to the actual messy world we live in, a world where involuntary unemployment was a very, very glaring reality.
And Keynes didn't just see this as some dry math problem. Listen to how he described writing this book. He called it a struggle of escape from habitual modes of thought and expression, which ramify into every corner of our minds. That is powerful stuff. He was basically staging an intellectual rebellion against a rigid, orthodox mindset that had controlled statecraft for over a century. He was asking his fellow economists to completely rewire how they saw the world. This comparison really shows the ultimate flip. He took the foundational pillar of 19th century economics and just turned it completely upside down. So instead of Say's law, where supply creates its own demand, we get what we now call Keynes's law. Demand creates its own supply. Keynes argued that it's the total amount of demand in the economy that dictates how much supply businesses will actually bother to produce, and as a result, how many workers they're going to hire.
All right, part 5, Understanding Effective Demand. This is our escape hatch. This idea of effective demand is literally the escape hatch Keynes built to get us out of the classical trap. Let's ground this with a modern example, okay? Imagine the tech company today building a massive factory to pump out thousands of new smartphones. Under the old classical mindset, just paying the factory workers and engineers would generate enough income in the economy to eventually buy those phones. But here is where Keynes brings human psychology into the mix. What if consumers get spooked? What if there's a panic, and instead of spending their paychecks, people hoard their cash under their mattresses, or just leave it sitting in their checking accounts? Suddenly, the money completely stops flowing. The tech company can't sell the phones, so what do? They halt production, they lay off workers, and boom, a general glut occurs. Not because they forgot how to make phones, but because effective demand has just vanished. That automatic cycle, totally broken. Keynes laid it out like this. Effective demand is essentially expected consumption plus expected investment. If that total effective demand is coming up short, just having factories and workers sitting around isn't going to magically prevent a recession. It leaves entrepreneurs playing what Keynes called a losing game of hazard. Because if people aren't consuming and businesses aren't investing because they're terrified of what's coming, the economy is going to shrink, and it's going to stay shrunk until something comes along to push that demand back up. Which leads us nicely into part 6, Modern Fiscal Policy, the New Landscape. So we're stepping out of that escape hatch to look at the new landscape. Let's just neutrally compare these two paradigms for a second. Under the classical orthodoxy, the market is viewed as entirely self-correcting. Recessions are just temporary blips, and the best thing the government can do is play laissez-faire, just keep its hands off. But under Keynesian economics, the market is prone to severe demand deficits. Recessions can be very real, incredibly persistent, and devastating. So the government's role has to shift dramatically toward active, counter-cyclical intervention. When the private sector stops spending, the public sector basically has to step in. And here is where we see the real-world, practical applications of these theories. The stuff we read about in the news every single time there's a crisis.
Keynes's insights gave birth to modern discretionary fiscal policy. It's exactly why, during an economic downturn, governments will use deficit spending to supplement demand. It is the core logic behind massive public works projects or stimulus checks. Those are direct injections of effective demand meant to offset what the private sector is hoarding, thanks to that paradox of thrift. Today, governments actively use their own spending to plug that gap, rather than waiting years and years for wages and prices to painfully self-correct on their own.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. We've taken this journey of intellectual escape together. But guys, these concepts aren't just history. They are exactly how we interpret the news today. So, when you look at the world facing a sudden economic shock or a crisis, ask yourself, do you naturally trust that invisible hand to self-correct, or do you see the absolute necessity for a guided escape through intervention? Basically, are your own habitual modes of thought classical or Keynesian? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next explainer.